turn on the news that night to a variety of channels, what are you going to hear? Biased approach, different versions of what the president said. So if you have a monk, a priest, that has a copy of that, is there a potential for that person to use whatever they find in here for their own benefit? Absolutely. If you were just to talk to anybody on the street, what would they say about this book? It's the Bible, but just talk to anybody on the street. What would they say about this book?
If they didn't know much about it, I hear a lot that it's just theoretical. It's not, it's a theory of how it's.
Okay, there's a lot of theory in there. Okay.
Some believe in it, some don't. Some believe in it, some don't.
Some people believe in it, some don't.
Some will say, I don't know anything about it at all.
Okay, some people don't know anything about it at all. That's right. I've heard some people say, well, that's the book that was on my grandmother's coffee table. It's a good book to keep records of your family's births and deaths and marriages and stuff, because there's that stuff been between the Old Testament and New Testament, all those pages where you fill out the forms.
I think chances are you'd probably get a different answer for every person you talk to.
You probably would. A lot of history in there. But when you get right down to it, the topic of this quarter is the foundation of our faith. And Richard and I are going to spend some time talking about this book. Not so much the content and what it teaches us, but how did we get this book? Where did it come from? Who wrote it? When was it written? How many different languages is it in? Versions is it in? How many editions have been? Because I think that if that's going to be what we believe in, if that's going to guide our lives, it would make sense for us to know the origins of the book. So I did a little looking on the internet, that authoritative place where everybody goes for all their information. You can find anything you want. But I did find the top 4 books that have been published in the history of the world. And the first one certainly was the Bible. And there's over 100 million copies of the Bible printed every year. And I'm going to ask you in a minute who printed them. See if you can think of that. It's an interesting answer. The second most popular book in the history of the world was Don Quixote. And over 500 million copies of that book have been printed, which pales in comparison to the hundreds of millions of copies of the Bible that have been printed. 200 million is A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens' book. And then 150 million is Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's book. But the Bible prints as many copies per year as those books have been printed in the history since they were written. And several 100 million copies of the Bible are printed, and I'll give you the name. It's Amity Press. Anybody have any idea where Amity Press is? Interestingly enough, it's in China, in a place which typically doesn't allow their citizens to have a copy of the Bible. So they must export them. But Amity Press, hundreds of millions of copies of the Bible every year. Over 100 million copies of the Bible are sold every year. In fact, it used to be, back years ago, it was listed on the top of the bestseller list all the time. but there's never any comparison to that and the number 2. So, but over 100 million copies of the Bible printed every year. And the Bible has been translated in over 690 different languages. I didn't know there were that many languages in the world. But the research I did said 690 different languages. So it certainly has had an impact on our society and on the world. If it's 690 languages around the globe, there were stories that I was reading about smuggling suitcases full of Bibles into Russia when the country of Russia had its difficulties when the Soviet Union broke up a few years ago. The ability people had to smuggle suitcases full of Bibles into that country. I have heard of people in South Korea who would attach a box of Bibles to a gas balloon, and when they had a south to north wind, they'd let those balloons go, and they'd go into North Korea, and people would shoot the balloons, and they'd drop, and they'd all grab a Bible. And if they were found with a Bible, then they were severely punished. Some even put to death. But that they would take that chance when they'd see those balloons come over, they'd somehow find a way to shoot the balloon down, pierce the balloon, and it would drop to the ground, and people would scramble to get the Bibles. So it's really had an impact. It's had an impact on the entire world, and so I think it's very appropriate that we spend a little bit of time looking at what's the foundation. Where does this come from? How do we have it in the way that we have it today? So that'll hopefully you'll find this interesting, and there'll also be some little tidbits of information that I'll share with you, such as, which is the first sport mentioned in the Bible? Fishing. That's close. It's tennis. It says Moses served in Pharaoh's court. Okay. But I think fishing is probably more accurate. So I'll try to come up with some of those and see and test your knowledge of the Bible. But so we've called this book the Bible. So where in this book is it found that we should call it the Bible? Ron's got the answer. Where is it, Ron? It's not in there, is it? It's exactly right. Nowhere in the Bible does it call itself the Bible. And so you have 20 questions, and that's the first one. If you want to jot down the answer to these questions, you're welcome to, and because it'd make a good test. But seriously, the Bible, the word Bible, comes from what Greek word? Biblios or Biblia, B-I-B-L-I-A or B-I-B-L-I-O. So it comes from the Greek word Biblia or Biblios. It wasn't called the Bible until about the 5th century. So about the 5th century is when someone actually referred to it as the Bible. So traditionally, the third question there, why is it not found on the bestseller list? It's always there. Pardon?
It would dominate. It would dominate the sales.
Absolutely. It would be on top of the list every time, and there would be it. So you couldn't say that is the bestseller. It would always be the Bible. So here's a nuts and bolts stuff that you should have learned when you were 4 or 5 years old, 3 or 4 years old. How many books are in the Bible? 5? 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, for a total of 66 books. So obviously it's not a book. It is a collection of books. But it's really not a collection of books because it's a mixture of books and letters and poems. So it's a compilation. And one of the interesting things we'll get into as we go through the next few weeks is, how did it come together? And were there any things kind of out there on the edge that maybe could have made it into the Bible, but really didn't make it? And we're going to find out that, yeah, there were. There were some books that were considered by scholars centuries ago that they were considering including in the canon, as we call it, but didn't make it. Yes, Richard?
When you look at the fact that it has one story, it has one theme throughout, it points to one thing, in a very large sense, you could say it is a book, one book.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the thing, that when you're little, you think, well, that's this big book, and then as you learn, well, it's not, one book, it's 66 books, but then when you really learn, you realize it's one book. And by the way, biblos, the Greek word, means book.
Yes.
That's what that word means.
Yeah. And if you think about the purpose of the Old Testament versus the New Testament, the Old Testament's purpose was what? Schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. It's anticipating what is to come. It is primarily prophecies. Here's what will happen. 6,900, according to the scholars, 6,900 prophecies in the Old Testament. And what was the purpose of the New Testament?
To fulfill those prophecies.
To provide documentation that those prophecies had been fulfilled. That's exactly right. And so when you begin to think about that, and then look at some other statistics we'll look at here in just a second, it's really amazing what this book provides us. So we got 66 books in the Old Testament, 66 books in the Bible, 39 in the Old, 27 in the New. Two major divisions are obviously the New Testament and Old Testament. How many divisions are there in the Old Testament? Because it's not really one consistent book. The Old Testament is contained by how many different divisions?
Are you talking like the patriarchal?
Yeah, five, that's exactly right. 5 of them. 5 different divisions. There's the books of law, which consist of what?
Genesis, Exodus, Lamentations, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
That's right. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The 5 books of the law. And then you have the books of history. We won't name all of them. Let's see if I can. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the books of history. And then you have 5 books of poetry. And then you have major prophets 5 and minor prophets 5. Some of those minor prophets are so minor it's hard to understand what they're talking about when you read the books. I taught a class one time on Amos, the prophet of social justice. I found a book that was titled that. Now that'd be a good class. So I read the book and kind of digested it, and that was a difficult study, but it was a kind of an interesting study. So what's the New Testament divisions? So what's the first few? First 4 are the Gospels. And what do the Gospels do? Yeah, it just tells us the life of Christ, don't they? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It kind of tells us the life of Christ. Then you have one book of history. And what's it the history of? Yeah, history of the establishment, early years of the church in the book of Acts. And then you got the major writer that kind of kicks in. Who was that? Paul. And he got 12 epistles, or 14 epistles that Paul wrote. And then there's 7 more epistles that other people wrote toward the end of the New Testament. And then you got one book that does what?
End times, Revelation.
I don't know what it does. I have had, where I've attended church in the past, people said, Stacy, would you teach a class on Revelation? I said, let me see if I can understand it myself before I teach a class on it. I have a tough time with that. Because you can pick almost any chapter of Revelation, find something in there that you can say, well, this is a prophecy of something that's going to come in our world today. I don't know. It is probably the toughest book in my mind to understand as you think of the Bible. So in Luke, the 24th chapter, in the 24th verse, and 44th verse, Christ referred to the Old Testament. Do you remember what he referred to that as? Somebody flip to Luke 24, verse 44, and read that. If you've got it, raise your hand, and Richard will let you read into the microphone.
I'm there, hold on. Now he said to them, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.
Okay, so he refers to it as the law of Moses, which, as we heard a minute ago, was kind of the patriarchal era, if you will. And then he also refers to it as prophecy, and he refers to it as Psalms. It's kind of the way that he has referred to it there in Luke, the 24th chapter and the 44th verse. So a wide variety of types of writings, from simply a history of what happened in the world during that period of time, all the way to beautiful songs and poems that are written typically in the book of Psalms and in some other places. Prophecies, here's what's going to happen. A lot of conversation about the coming of Christ and the coming of the Anointed One, not knowing at that time who that was or when that was going to happen. I mean, the people of the Old Testament, you're talking about somewhere around 4,000 years of time that's covered by the Old Testament books, if you will. So if you think about who wrote this book, over 40 different people wrote the Bible. Name some of them for me.
Moses, Ezra, Luke, Matthew, Mark, John, Paul, Peter, James, David.
Absolutely. Now, if you think about that, what were some of their occupations?
Tax collector.
Tax collector?
Physician.
Tent makers? Physicians?
Guy that persecuted Christians.
People who persecuted Christians? Fishermen? Shepherds? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are all types of people. It wasn't that these scholars in a university somewhere sat down together and decided we're going to write a big book. And they wrote the book. No. These are people from all walks of life who had no contact with each other, no relationship with each other to a large extent. I mean, when you get into the New Testament, there's some of that goes on, and from generation to generation, a little bit of it in the Old Testament, but it was spread over such a long period of time that the people who wrote some of those books lived hundreds of years after the people who wrote others. Yes?
We can say the Holy Spirit.
One more time.
Holy Spirit.
Oh, Holy Spirit. What about the Holy Spirit?
He gathered it.
Yeah. So the consistency that you have, and that's kind of the culminating point I'll make today, and I'll make it again at the end. The consistency that you have in this book is more, you couldn't take, I mean, there's probably 40 of us sitting in this room. You couldn't take 40 of us and put us together in a room and have us write a book that's 1,500 pages long. And I don't care how long we spent. Let's say we spent 5 years going through and writing that book and checking it. You could not have, anyone could go back and find all sorts of discrepancies and problems and mistakes in a book that 40 of us would write. But if you look at the consistency of this book that was written, and we'll get into the years here in just a second, written over a long period of time by people from all walks of life, and it comes together. And to have the consistency that you have in this book, it is, which is, I think, exactly right. I think it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. So, 8 different people wrote the New Testament, probably. There's some question about Hebrews, but 8 different people wrote the New Testament. 32 different people wrote the Old Testament. And so let's talk about when these things are written. So I did a little research here. And I went back and I looked, okay, according to scholars, what are the oldest books? Job, according to scholars, we really don't know. Because it was written, according to scholars, sometime between Abraham and when the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity. So, and by the way, regardless of who says when it was written, how do we come to that conclusion?
Well, Job lived the ripe old age up into the 400s, and by the time the Babylonian exile was going, people weren't living that long.
Okay.
So it fits perfectly into the Genesis time frame when people were living that long.
Well, who was the oldest person? And how long did he live?
969.
Yeah. I mean, you think of the period of time, scholars will tell you that the oldest books of the Old Testament that we know of, we don't know about Job, was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and some of the Psalms. And all of which are written somewhere around 1450 to 1400 BC. So that's the scholars looking at that. The newest books of the Old Testament, remember, our Old Testament's all the time before Christ. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah were all written somewhere in the neighborhood of 450 to 400 BC. So now if you think about that, you've got 1,000 years from 1450 to 400. 1,050 years, period of time when authors were writing things. And they didn't sit down at their computer and type out 20 pages a day. I mean, when they wrote something, how'd they do it? Yeah, they hand wrote things in the language of their day. We'll talk about that in just a second. They hand wrote things, and then somebody would see that, and they would take it and they would copy it word for word. So they would have 2 copies of the same book. Any book, any reading, any document that you had during that period of time, that's how it happened. Other than the 10 Commandments, and they got chiseled in stone for a little more permanency. That was the memory. Instead of sticking it in memory and keeping it for a long time, you chiseled it in stone if you really wanted to keep it. But then, when you look at the New Testament, the first book in the New Testament was written right around 45 AD. And that was the book of James. So as we look at the books in the Bible, they're not listed in chronological order. That'd be a good question. I don't know why they're listed in the order that they're listed in. Anybody know that? I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about that. I'll see if I do a little more research and find out why the Bible's listed. Books are written in the in the order that they're in. It's not chronological.
Well, they break it down by the divisions, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, they are common themes, if you will. So you got the Law of Moses for the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch is what it's called. So those have a common theme of history of that particular time frame. But the earliest book being James, about 45 to 49. And the last book, and by the way, the New Testament was written in a much more compacted period of time. Because the first book, according to scholars, was written in 45. The last book was written, John wrote, most of his writings were somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 95 AD. So 85 to 96, I think, is what most scholars will tell you that John and also 1st, 2nd, 3rd John were written. So when you were growing up, and the first Bible you ever saw, do you remember what kind of Bible it was? What version of the Bible it was?
New King James.
The King James version of the Bible. Is that the original?
It's the authorized one.
Pardon?
It's the authorized one.
The authorized.
It says it
who's
right
it
in the front.
authorized by?
By King James.
King James. Now, I had an opportunity. Yes, sir.
So I'm reading 12 Ordinary Men because I'm teaching a men's group back at Norfolk. But William Tyndale, he actually died translating the Bible from Latin to English. It was so unpopular for him to do so, but he did get it successfully done, and he ended up getting strangled by very bad people at him. But before English even came out, the English version came out, most according didn't even realize there were 12 apostles.
We're going to talk about him in a couple weeks.
Okay.
Exactly right. Exactly right. It's got to be interesting. But King James, I had an opportunity years ago to listen to this, having a senior moment. The guy who wrote Perversion of the Versions, not Gus Nichols, but Foy Wallace. Yes, Foy Wallace. Thank you, Foy Wallace. I had an interesting opportunity to hear Foy Wallace speak. He was a very prolific writer and prolific speaker. I'll give you one little anecdotal situation. He was holding a meeting, a series of lectureships, if you will, at the West Sparta Church of Christ in Sparta, Tennessee. And I was visiting from Illinois, and I thought, man, I had never heard this man. Heard about him all my life. I want to go hear him. Sunday morning, my dad was the minister of that congregation, and that congregation had a habit of, they would have their Bible study at 9, their worship service at 10, and then at 11, about 15 or 20 people in the congregation would go to the nursing home there in town and conduct a service for the people who could not come to the building. And so Brother Wallace was preaching in his meeting. He started one Monday and it was going to end on Sunday. And at night, the meeting would go, he would preach for an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. I mean, it was pretty lengthy. And so on Sunday morning, my dad said, now, Brother Wallace, we have an obligation to hold this service at the nursing home at 11, so we're going to have to people are going to have to leave and go do, oh, no problem, I'll be finished with it. So, for some reason, my dad said, Stacy, want to go with me? And I said, sure. And so, he was really going strong at 11 o'clock, and we drove across town, we did the service at the nursing home, we did communion and all that, we all drove back and walked in. He's still going. 2.5 hours later, he finally wrapped it up. But the interesting thing about Foy Wallace was he wrote a book called The Perversion of the Versions, and he was a real advocate of the value, if you will, of the King James Version. And his justification was that King James put together 80 scholars, and he told them he wanted them to take some original manuscripts, as original as we could get, and translate them into English. And he said, if you make a mistake, I will have you beheaded. So when you think about what's the damage done, or what do we do to somebody who makes a mistake when they copy something and they have a typographical error, or they say something wrong? I mean, there's no consequence to that today, but there was then. So he said he knew of no translation of the Bible that had that consequence if somebody made a mistake. And so he was a real fan of the King James Version, and certainly since that time, and that was probably 20 years ago that I heard him, but since that time there's just numerous versions. We're going to talk about those in later weeks, but numerous versions that have been published and are available to us. A lot of ways, and Neil talks about that from his pulpit. He says, the way versions say things sometimes makes more sense to us in today's world, because we don't speak in the these and thous. Now, in that service, one of the services of that week, Brother Wallace, he preached on the importance of formalizing our conversation with God to show our respect to God, and how we should say thee and thou and those types of things anytime we communicate with God. And he was very, very dynamic and very bold in his, and at the end of the lesson, Kenneth Brawl said, and Stacy, would you come up and lead our closing prayer? Oh. Okay. So I was afraid I was going to say something wrong. With him standing at the back, I was going to address God in the wrong way and get reprimanded by Floyd Wallace, but I managed to get through a very short prayer by saying these and thous and those types of things. But that's just the nature of the language during that period of time, during King James' world. It's not that way today. And so a lot of Bibles have been published, a lot of translations have been made. In that ensuing 1611 was the King James Version, and since that's come out, there's probably 500 or so different translations of the Bible. So, how many years was there between the writing of the Old Testament ended and the writing of the New Testament began?
Approximately 400.
Probably around 400. Probably around 400 years. Were any books written during that period of time?
Yes.
Yes? What do they call them? You remember? When you combine them? Apocrypha, yes. The Apocrypha. It's actually 15 books. I'll bring a copy of it when we talk about that in some detail later in the quarter. But there's about 15 books, and it looks like the Bible. I mean, there's chapters and verses and all the stuff that you would normally expect to see if you look at any page of the Bible. But they're not inspired writings, because the people who wrote those, Josephus and other people, Maccabees and other people like them, were people who really were not inspired. They were not closely associated with Christ. They were not apostles. So when you look at that period of time, you're in between the Testaments, if you will. There was a period of about 400 years that the Apocrypha covers. That there are some writings, there are some historical writings, but they're not considered inspired parts or portions, if you will, of the content of the Bible. How long did it take to write the Bible? So if you go back to around 1500, when the first book was written, and the last book was written around 96 AD, about 1600 years to write the entire Bible. And then, what does the Bible cover in terms of time? If you think about the earliest things it talks about and the last things it talks about, what does it cover in terms of time? That's kind of a trick question. because it covers time from the formation of the world until the end of time, which isn't here yet. There are verses, scriptures about all of that in between. From the formation of the world until the end of time, judgment. There are passages throughout the Bible that talk about all of those things. So, easy question, what two languages was the Bible written in? Greek and Hebrew. Which one's which?
Old Testament Hebrew.
Yes, Old Testament's Hebrew. New Testament's written in what is called Koine Greek, or classical Greek. So if you were looking at something in around 1,000, or you had the whole Bible, had a copy of it, stack of handwritten books and letters, and you were looking at that, and someone said, hey, tell me about such and such an event. Why would it have been difficult to find? Why would it have been difficult to find in that stack of documents?
Order. There was no number. There was no.
Chapters or verses.
Chapters and verses. Where'd that come from?
Must come from King James.
Initially, there's some discrepancy, but initially, in fact, I heard a professor when I was at Lipscomb tell me, and of course, you know, Lipscomb professors are infallible, right, Monty?
Most of the time.
Since Monty was one. But I heard a professor at Lipscomb say that it was translated by Cardinal Hugo while he was riding a mule across Europe. That's what he did to pass the time. He divided the Bible typically into chapters. There is some discrepancy because some people will tell you that Stephen Langston did that about 30 years prior to that. That was about 1220, but not a lot of documents that say that. Yes, Monty?
Well, the other piece to this is the scriptures were not readily available to people like you and me.
Who had them?
The church had them, the priest had them, and others officials. But as far as you or me or other people having their copy that they could even look at, it wasn't there yet.
Wasn't on their coffee table, was it?
And as was alluded to earlier by Patrick, to get into that and try to get that together for people was a deadly business. And I suppose you'll talk about that later. But what we have here on our phones and wherever is a marvelous thing that for hundreds and hundreds of years, people did not have at all. And we need to appreciate that, I think, more than we do.
So, two questions. Why didn't they have it? And since they didn't have it, what did that create in the rank and file of the population of people who were spiritual, who were...
Well, some couldn't read the language it was written in, number one. And some
What
probably...
was it written in for a while?
Well, it would be probably the Latin version.
Hebrew, Greek, Latin.
And even when it was translated, say, into German or English and other common languages, many people did not know how to read that either.
Right.
So you had those who could read, which was mostly church officials, a few people that were probably in the aristocracy or were in the king's house that were educated. But you take the masses, what, 90%, 85%? They were out in the fields or wherever they were working, but they weren't being taught how to read and write. And in some cases, it was probably illegal if somebody taught them that.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of cultural factors there which worked against most people having it and being able to appreciate it like we do. Had to rely on others to tell them.
Absolutely. And there's one other thing. And you know, if you take, let's take any president of the United States gives a speech, and you turn on the news that night to a variety of channels, what are you going to hear? biased approach, different versions of what the president said. So if you have a monk, a priest, that has a copy of that, is there a potential for that person to use whatever they find in here for their own benefit? Absolutely. So one of the ways they controlled the 90%, as you said, and I think that's probably a good number, one of the ways they controlled the 90% was to go to particular parts of the Bible that they had found that would control the people that were under their jurisdiction and use that to control them. Yes, Richard?
Got a comment here?
Sure.
Well, also up until Gutenberg printed the first Bible in movable type and all that good stuff, I mean, any copy of the scriptures were handwritten, which had to be very expensive if you can even afford to get them. So only the rich could even afford anything, any copies of the Bible that were handwritten. Right. And so then you had a lot of rich people that had copies of the Bible, and of course they kind of had to believe what was in there. I mean, the poor people would have to believe what was in there because they were being told by people that actually had copies where the lowly poor people couldn't afford them. So there was a class system going on.
So if you've got the Bible and you've got a monk or a priest reading the Bible and then telling the people what it said, there's a potential for a little bias, as you said. Yes, sir.
Well, I was just gonna add. I don't need this. I was just gonna add on top of it. Religious elitism was big business back then. Especially, I mean, Jesus challenged the power of the seas, and what happened? They put him to death. The same thing holds true through the centuries before the Bible truly got translated and became mainstream. Religious elitism controlled everything, and this offered people true freedom.
Yes.
By getting to know it themselves.
He mentioned the printing press. When you look at historically one of the greatest events in the world that have happened, one of the first one that's always mentioned is the invention of the printing press, because it gave the ability to communicate, I know I'm out of time, sorry, gave ability to communicate to the masses when they hadn't had it before that, hadn't been able to read the Bible or anything else. And so it's kind of an interesting change, dynamic shift in what happened in the course of the world. And then the last point I'll make is the chapters and verses, chapters by Cardinal Hugo or Stephen Langston, depending upon who you talk to. And then Stephanus, in the Vulgate version of the Bible, we'll talk about a little later, was in 1555. So for 300 years, we just had chapters. And then finally in 1550, we got the Vulgate version, which was chapters and verses, which gave people the ability to find something that they were looking for. Go to this book, this chapter, and this verse. So think about that. That's only 600 years. So the book is a marvelous example of what God has given us, a blessing that He has given us. We're going to explore the creation of this book and how it's put together, how it was translated as we move forward. I'll be with you again next week, and then Richard will have a couple of weeks, and we'll kind of go through this piece at a time as we begin to explore the foundation of our faith. Well, thank you for your comments and questions.